Vietnam's evangelical an overview of Vietnam's evangelical churches after 48 years of communist rule. Some 56 years of mission involvement in Vietnam have convinced me that it's not very useful to talk about, quote, the church in Vietnam. Are we talking about a small single congregation denomination, or one of 1,000 plus congregations of legally recognized denominations, or a similar sized non-recognized house church organization? Are we talking about a dozen Christians in a remote highland region who rotate, meeting in their little humble thatched huts, or hundreds of urban believers, some of whom arrive in chauffeur-driven limousines to meet in a large traditional church building on a prominent street in a big city? Are we talking about a century-old church tradition, or a group of believers that first came together for the first time last week? To say nothing of the 8 million strong, 4-century-old Roman Catholic churches. So I say we can only speak with any accuracy about congregations, churches, and so on that we know. Despite my 135 missions to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam since 1980, I've already made 3 since COVID. And the many contacts that I have, I always know only in part. And I come away from every visit, every meeting, every conversation wondering, what am I missing? The information I share here most of it is available in the public domain. Opinions expressed are my own. I'm not making an attempt here to evaluate the spiritual temperature of Vietnam's churches, but rather provide history, some data, some sociological analysis to give you a big picture to understand the situation of churches in Vietnam. So with these qualifications, I'm pleased to share some observations and information with you. For me, it's early in the morning here. First of all, some big picture statistics. According to the government stats, there are 9 legally recognized evangelical denominations in Vietnam. These encompass 3,300 registered congregations with about 1.2 million followers, the government says. Our best estimate would place the number of evangelicals at around 2 million, and this is a 1,300% increase since the communist takeover. And the number of congregations we say is somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000. We seem to rear the government that there are about 90 evangelical denominations, many quite small. The Strategic Vietnam Partnership, founded in 1997, has been working diligently on church mapping, a term I'm sure you'll know, but encountering considerable hesitation about sharing accurate information on the part of the churches. Now, I want to show you a slide here. This concentric slide shows you the development of church and mission work in Vietnam since 1911. So evangelical work has been going on in Vietnam since 1911, about 110 years. And this development shows churches as they were, lists churches as they were found historically. Here is the dates and so on. I could easily lecture or give a course on this for a week, but I must just show you this to let you know that we diligently are studying and have studied the history of Vietnam, and we make this available. This is made available to all of our members in the Strategic Vietnam Partnership. Every year, about 100 of us meet for a week in October in Bangkok, where we have a consultation on Vietnam. I think Seth already mentioned my book, Vietnam's Christians, A Century of Growth and Adversity. This will give you it's a primer on evangelicalism in Vietnam. Okay. Now, during the Vietnam War, one would study that chart a little bit more carefully. During the Vietnam War, there were 32 international Christian organizations in Vietnam. 9 of them were church planting. After the war, we have made a record of at least 800 Christian organizations, all the way from small mom and pop sized ones to 800-pound gorillas or some of the big ones. I'm unable to tell you though how many of those make church planting or contributing to church planting a main activity. But if you think of it, 32 before the end of the war, and under communism, at least 800 organizations have said that they have done something in Vietnam. Some comments now on legalization and registration. The government requires all Christian groups to come into a registration and legal framework. There's often confusion between the two terms: recognized, which means legal recognition by the government, and registered. In this two-tiered system, congregations may be registered locally to carry on religious activities. Such registered congregations may belong to legally recognized denominations or to those not legally recognized. Both of these categories may also have unregistered congregations. So 2 decades of promises by the government to streamline and consolidate this process for churches toward registration and recognition have not been realized, but this remains the government plan. For all Christian groups in Vietnam, the government's communist ideology, policies, actions, and concerning religion hang over them like a cloud. Yet, Christian leaders and organizations have shown great resourcefulness and agility in carrying on worship, witness, and service despite it. Now, some big picture realities. The first is ethnic minority dominance. A full 80% of evangelical believers in Vietnam are ethnic minorities, which constitute only 14% of Vietnam's general population. Ethnic minority churches continue to grow, though not at the pace they did in the 90s and in the early 2000s. Sort of an important corollary of this ethnic dominance of the churches in Vietnam is that the movement is predominantly rural. Now, one of the very largest ethnic groups is called the Hmong, and they lived primarily in the northwest mountainous region along the China and Lao borders. The Hmong movement to Christian faith was sparked by radio broadcasts in the late 1980s and has come to include up to 400,000 believers. It has been described by some as the most remarkable Christian growth phenomenon of its time. Originally, the movement came geographically and naturally under the oversight of the historic Evangelical Church of Vietnam. But soon other church organizations also wanted a piece of this amazing growth, and now about a dozen church organizations do. The fortunes of various organizations with Hmong churches have waxed and waned, often in relationship to available outside financing, quality of training, and leadership provided. Currently, there is instability, uncertainty, discouragement, and some schism on the Hmong church front, exacerbated by both government hostility and by unwise help from outside interveners who may mean well, but often do not do well. So here are some facts and observations about this amazing movement to Christ among the Hmong. Number one, authorities are reported to be active in sowing discord among Hmong churches and to try to divide them, and are sometimes successful. Secondly, despite many appeals over the years, nearly 500 Hmong congregations belonging to the legally recognized Evangelical Church of Vietnam North, historically the first denomination in Vietnam as a result of the missionary work of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Over 500 of these churches remain unregistered. Thirdly, there's interdenominational conflict and exclusivity. For example, some churches disapprove of marriage across denominational lines. About 60,000 Hmong, mostly Christians from the northwest mountainous region, moved to the Central Highlands beginning in the mid-1990s. So this positively spread the faith geographically, but was also destabilizing in other respects. Police and local authorities in places such as Dien Bien and Nghe Ang provinces are a law unto themselves. Authorities use compliant individuals to infiltrate churches and to report on activities and on news of any strangers attending meetings. Extremely harsh persecution persists in some places in Vietnam. And another big problem that is disturbing the Hmong movement to Christ is aggressive cults. I have a couple of pages of descriptions of cults here, but I'll just summarize very quickly. You may recognize the names of some. The Eastern Lightning cult out of China, the Yung Vung Min cult, is indigenous to Vietnam, but has echoes of Christianity, but is cultic. The Jesus organization, led by a U.S. Hmong named Rabbi David Herr, has legalistic Judaic elements and also an extreme prosperity gospel component that promises 1,000% return on investment in 1 year. The US-based Ba Ca Do cult, God's youngest daughter, they believe that God's youngest daughter has been incarnated in a Hmong Jesus woman. Another is an aberrant Pentecostal group from Minnesota. And there are also others that have infiltrated the Hmong churches and have lured some immature Christians and so on into their fold. Each of these cults claims anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 followers. The most perceptive missionary to the Hmong that I know concludes, and I quote, "The infiltration of cults among the Hmong and sects is a substantial problem. The Hmong churches are so split and fractured that these cults are attracting disaffected outliers and others not well grounded in their faith." There is a large church called the Christian Fellowship Church, which had hundreds of Hmong congregations, and a few years ago, it invited an American Lutheran congregation that had some Hmong people in it to come and teach pastors in their churches in Vietnam. Well, the new outside interveners claim on their website that in 2 years their training was so successful that the number of Christians went from 53,000 to 140,000. And their website claims that the Christian Fellowship Church of this Vietnamese denomination would fully join the Lutherans. So there you have it. Instant church planting success, come and help, and then hijack a denomination. These are some of the things that are very concerning in this wonderful movement to Christian faith. Established churches among the Hmong are very creative. The government is constantly shutting down their Bible schools and so on, yet they continue to creatively find other ways of doing training. There's also a few Hmong individuals from the United States that have gone to Vietnam and caused great problem and divisions by teaching false things. A modern apostle couple who travels widely and non-denominationally among the Hmong has reported great hunger for the truth among Hmong Christians. In part, they believe because they are missing some basic theological understandings, as well as teaching on very practical Christian issues such as Christian marriage and family life. So these intra and intergroup problems, the external threats of cults, and the sometimes harsh application by the authorities of the containment policy all weigh heavily on the Hmong evangelical movement. Now I'll make some remarks about church unity and divisions in general. I see three kinds of church unity. Number one, various levels of organizational or visible ecumenical unity. Secondly, grassroots unity among believers. And thirdly, comprehensive spiritual unity proclaimed in the prayer by Jesus in John 17 and affirmed in the ancient creeds. A good situation in the former two is testimony that the third is at least being partially realized. Now I'd like to show you we call it the denominational bubble chart. It's easy to understand, it is an understatement to say that organizational unity in Vietnam is complicated. It seems that churches in Vietnam struggle a lot with a dynamic tension of undeniable unity and considerable diversity. The tensions among evangelicals in Vietnam are many: north, south, charismatic, non-charismatic, ethnic minority versus kin, or that is ethnic Vietnamese, conservative style worship to newer expressions, and generational tensions, to name only some. Following the formation of the pioneer house churches in the late 1980s, there came an explosion of mostly smaller groups, now numbering about 90 in all, and some proudly wearing the unbiblical badge of independent. So in this particular chart, you see the explosion of these groups. Until 1960, basically there was one denomination in Vietnam. So for the first 50 years, only one denomination in Vietnam. Then there were 6 or 7 developed during the Vietnam War, and then under communism, it has exploded to about 90 different groups. Some of us, both overseas Vietnamese and myself, have worked years to encourage unity. And in 2018, finally, Vietnam, a critical mass of Vietnam's churches joined together to form the Vietnam Evangelical Alliance. There were precursors in Saigon trying to bring together churches, and also in the north. I won't bother naming them. But in summary, the Vietnam Evangelical Alliance embraces these former groups that were formed in Hanoi and Saigon, and also the historic Evangelical Church of Vietnam in the north. The major outlier is the largest evangelical denomination in Vietnam, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam South. Its top leaders still decline to accept the house churches as legitimate and nurse concerns over divisions and misunderstandings more than 30 years old. If you'll remember the last slide for just a moment, and you see all these smaller house church organizations that have formed. In my experience, people have gone to Vietnam with good intentions, church planting and so on, and they have established a relationship with one of those small groups. And then they come sometimes to our meetings and they talk about the church in Vietnam. They base all their information on one small, tiny church. Some of them even unaware that there is a whole pantheon of other evangelical churches and a long history in Vietnam. On another front, there is also tension between the historic church bodies, the Northern and Southern Evangelical Church of Vietnam bodies, which were products of the Christian and Missionary Alliance missionary work. For years, there were attempts to reunify the two North and South organizations, which were historically one before the country was divided in 1954. But that failed. But then finally in 2018, a generalist in 2018, serious tensions developed between the North and the South. Not only did they not try to reunite, but they both decided that they would go north and go south and no longer sort of abide by this historic division between the two countries. I would say that greater unity among Vietnam's evangelical bodies could make many kingdom building contributions. The deep divisions, including even violence, demonstrated by the pre-COVID Hanoi church conflicts, point to an urgent need for reconciliation skills and tools. And there are some plans afoot to help bring these to Vietnam. Now, before I come to my conclusion, I have a few remarks here on persecution and church growth. The time of intense persecution, which prevailed from the 1980s until the early 2000s, coincided with a period of the greatest church growth during the modern communist period. The main growth was among ethnic minorities in remote, mountainous, and highland regions. This has led a very few people, unthinkingly, to conclude that persecution caused church growth, and that advocating for the persecuted is opposing God's evangelism plan. To this, my more than 40 years of advocacy experience say a categorical no. In my view, growth has happened despite persecution. But the relationship of growth and persecution is much more nuanced than I can handle in this brief time together. And now my summary. In my view, the following are among the top Kingdom of God concerns. They deserve careful and prayerful consideration in ministry planning by indigenous churches as well as those from the outside who would help them. First is kin evangelism. Ethnic Vietnamese remain the most unreached people in Vietnam and make up 86% of the population of the country. There are some good things going on. For one thing, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam South has a grand plan for every church to plant a daughter church in the next 4 years. On a peer basis, one house church based in the northern part of Vietnam is called the Word of Life Church. And it is often mentioned by others as having a strong outreach to the Vietnamese, that is, the most unreached people group in Vietnam. Its top leader articulated these principles to me during my March visit to Vietnam. Number one, a laser focus on a clear goal to guide you. Number two, the most open to the gospel are the many migrants that are flocking to big cities looking for employment. Number three, use bivocational workers who support themselves. This is kind of new to Vietnam because Vietnam has become very accustomed to having evangelists and pastors pastors supported with outside funds. And number 4 here, be sure your workers develop intentional mutual encouragement and accountability among them. And then finally, just open new churches. Don't perseverate over trying to get government permission. Just do it. A second major issue is to confront the threats to the integrity of the Hmong Christian community, which makes up a large portion of Vietnam's evangelicals. I've explained the problems above. Thirdly, I would say thirdly is to work on mutual respect and functional unity to strengthen evangelical witness, build and broaden the Vietnam Evangelical Alliance, and include relations with non-members. In my opinion, there has been a long need to develop a common theology and practice of relations with the state to ameliorate the repeated divide and rule intervention that is practiced by the authorities. This challenge won't soon go away. And finally, we take comfort and direction from Christ's affirmation to his disciples in Matthew 16:18. I will build my church. He has been and is building his churches in Vietnam. Our family there has been through hell and high water and regularly faces threats most of us have not experienced. So I say to those who would be called to work in Vietnam, to go humbly alongside them with wisdom and power of the Holy Spirit to help bear their burdens and to encourage and enable his people so they may shine the gospel light into the darkness around them. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Professor Reimer. What a great presentation, a good reminder of the need around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, for the gospel. What we're going to do at this time is that if we can just break out in smaller groups for about 7 minutes, and one of the purposes of doing this is to not only get to know one another, but to also share in the learning process. What are some things that kind of stuck out for you? Excuse me, and what are some things in your context that are relatable? So we'll just do that for 7 minutes, and then we'll come back together. And hopefully you've kind of, I wrote down a lot of questions that that kind of popped up in my mind that we can ask after we come back. And as we ask those questions, Professor Reimer will then share some of his thoughts. And then once again, we're going to end this at 8:30. And then those of us who want to stick around, you can stick around a little bit and we'll try to finish off some of the other questions. So Claire, if you could put us in breakout rooms at this moment.